Welcome to this ACUR ANU student presentation session. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging. My name is Rhiannon, I'll be chairing today's session, and our first presenter for today is Abby Gallagher, so please start when you're ready.
Cool, thank you. Let me just share my screen. All right, so my research is titled Healthy Prisons Are an Oxymoron, and it's an abolitionist critique into the Alexander McConaughey Centre. So the Alexander McConaughey Centre is the ACT's first and only prison. It was built in 2008 and it was promoted to be Australia's first human rights compliant prison. So what that meant was the government announced it would operate under the Healthy Prisons philosophy, which essentially focuses on the respect and protection of detainee human rights and their rehabilitation. And that human rights focus was enshrined in ACT legislation in the Human Rights Act and the Corrections Management Act. So this human rights focus also extended to practical features within the prison. So the rhetoric around the prison focused strongly on human rights being reflected in the architectural design of the prison, including having no bars on the windows, having brightly coloured doors, and accommodating natural light in the design of the prison. It was also reflected in the namesake. Alexander McConaughey was an 18th century penal reformer who advocated for rehabilitation over punishment, and he believed that punishment shouldn't be cruel. However, just over a decade on, there's been a pattern of human rights breaches, there's been riots at the prison, there's been a death in custody against the backdrop of rising incarceration rates, several expansions to the prison, and the lowest time out of cells for any Australian jurisdiction. So with all of those, the AMC has ticked off most of the milestones that are expected to occur at prisons. And the photos on the slide just gives a bit of an indication of the expansion that has occurred over the past decade at the prison. So my thesis essentially asked why has there been such a large gap between what was anticipated at to occur at this prison and what actually occurred. And so in the end, I argued that the AMC exemplifies the abolitionist position that a prison will never be human rights compliant, and that notions of reform and human rights do not change the structural harm that's caused by carceral systems. So just a quick note on abolition. This was the theoretical framework I used to guide my paper, and it's a theory and movement that essentially advocates for the abolishment of prisons in society, but it's a transitional movement, so it doesn't expect this to occur overnight. But it focuses on exposing the harm that prison creates, challenging its purpose, and revealing its ineffectual nature in deterring and rehabilitating offenders. There's also a distinction between abolition and reform. Essentially, abolitionists argue that because prisons by their institutional nature are punitive, they are inherently unable to be reformed. And the word carceral, it just means relating to a prison. I just use it throughout the rest of the presentation. So the first section of my research focused on that in practice, the AMC has not lived up to the commitment to be a human rights compliant prison. And I argued this failure to live up to it contributes to the abolitionist position that human rights and prisons are inherently contradictory. So to do this, I chronologically mapped how those initial commitments to human rights fared over time at the prison by looking at the prison's operational history. So I found that both the first and most recent external review on the prison both stated that the elements are there and the ingredients are in place to function as a human rights compliant prison, but that there were operational deficiencies that were holding this vision back. So there's almost a decade between these two reports, yet the problem identified is pretty much exactly the same, that the prison hasn't been able to live up to this vision of human rights compliance. And just quickly, there's quite a few reoccurring human rights issues at the prison, one of which is the integration of remanded detainees and sentenced detainees in the same areas of the prison, which is contrary to both ACT and international law. Also, detainees reporting only 1 to 2 hours of programs in education and employment a week, in contrast to the envisioned 30 hours, and also overcrowding concerns So that impacts detainee access to resources and facilities. And the prison was originally only meant to have a max capacity of 270, and now it has a maximum capacity of 539. So I argued that this shows that the strength of a commitment to human rights compliance is not, it appears, positively correlated with human rights outcomes. That reformist ideals have not prevailed in a setting that the government has exclusive control over, I argued contributes to the abolitionist position that ensuring human rights in a prison is at the very least difficult to operationalise. The second part of my thesis, I undertook a discourse analysis into rhetoric expressed by the ACT government about human rights at the prison from about 2004 to 2020. So that's what the figure on the slide there shows, the number of documents that I analysed for each year group. And essentially my discourse analysis revealed that the government initially perpetuated a very idealistic and categorical meaning conclusive commitment to human rights at the prison. However, over time, as the prison's operation unfolded, that rhetoric around human rights became very qualified and it equivocated on those initial commitments made. So I had a lot of quotes in the body of my paper to demonstrate this, but just for the purpose of the presentation, I'm just going to show two. So this first one, I'm not going to read out the entire quote, but essentially this language, this is from 2008, so this is the year that the prison opened. And essentially this language created an idea that the brutalism inherent to prisons can be designed out. And it also perpetuated the overarching human rights narrative around this prison. So then if we compare that to the next quote, which I'll just bring up as well, which I'll just read out the last line of this, the second last line, expectations will change, circumstances will change, there will be different views on exactly what human rights compliance is. So this is a few years later, the prison has well and truly been operating for a while now, and most of the language that I analysed from this time period indicated that the narrative had shifted from one that was an active reference to human rights at the prison into one that starts treating it as a future aspiration rather than a present reality. So it's referring to it in a future rather than active tense. And I argue that this analysis indicates that words do not automatically produce human rights outcomes in prisons. You need more than that, which again supports the abolitionist position that human rights in a prison is very difficult to operationalise. So those 2 points sort of build up to the last one, which is that the idea of a human rights compliant prison is ontologically, it's an ontological oxymoron. So I used abolition theory to argue that this grand vision of human rights in rhetoric and legislation operated to disguise that at the end of the day, it's still a prison, and by its institutional nature, it functions as a site of violence and control. The picture I have on the slide there, I argued that the colour of the doors is a performative example of this human rights-centred approach to punishment. So colourful doors do not change that it's a prison. Those incarcerated are still caged inside these doors as just one material representation of their renunciation of human rights. So relatedly, I argued that the AMC demonstrates how a reformist agenda distracts from the harm that institutional punishment creates. So this is where the distinction between abolition and reform comes in. The masquerade of prisons as some visionary reform further naturalizes the carceral system. This is because it doesn't challenge the oppressive foundations upon which it is built and on which it operates. So another image on the slide there, I also argued this was another performative example of how the reformist agenda did not materially change outcomes. So while detainees have a view that's unobstructed by bars, the window is a slit in a steel door. These windows still operate as a hard and physical barrier to the outside world. So essentially, under abolitionist critique, no reform, regardless of the intentions behind it, will counter the prison's punitive mode of operation. Indeed, that is intrinsic to it. So this argument operated not only as a critique of how the AMC has unfolded in practice and the human rights breaches that have occurred, but of the original vision in its entirety. Okay, so just quickly on solutions, I argued that the only solution to this problem is to turn to abolition and to encourage the ACT community and the ACT government that further prison expansion and construction and further liberalised reforms are not the answer. And it requires convincing the ACT community that the prison is incapable of addressing the social harm that it supposedly protects us from. I also argued that there's not only potential and desire for this change in the ACT, but that the situation at the AMC demands it. So ultimately, my research used the AMC as an example of the irreconcilable tension between human rights and prisons. I said it was dangerous to rely on the concepts of human rights and reforms to materially change outcomes for people who are imprisoned. I also argued that I also tried to use this research as a way to expose the brutal reality of carceral institutions, whatever the philosophical underpinnings. And I argued that abolition is the only path to the structural change that will liberate us all. So thanks for listening, and thank you to my supervisor, Judy Harrison, who supervised this project. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. We now have a few minutes for Q&A. So judges, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask away.
Okay, I suppose I'll just kick off the question. Right, thanks, Abby. Thanks for your interesting talk. I actually came from a very, very different background. So in like hardcore science, something like that. So not quite used to when I don't see a lot of numbers and stuff on the slides. So just wondering if it is actually common in this field for people to look at numbers and stuff and make conclusions from that. And if so, what are the, can you think of any data that you can collect to sort of back up your arguments and stuff like that?
Sure. Yeah, so my paper wasn't, I didn't do quantitative research. My discourse analysis, I guess it involved numbers in the sense that there was documents that I had to tally up. But yeah, no, I didn't use empirical data at all in my project. I'm not really sure how you would with this particular topic. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I think it would be quite interesting to interview sort of, which is still qualitative, so not quantitative, but it's still data. It would have been really interesting to interview some of the people who were involved in its construction at the government level, compared with to now, and how they saw the sort of the disconnect between what's happened and why they think that's happened. So I think like interviews could have really enhanced this project had I had the time or the ethics approval, but I can't actually think of the data that would, what quantitative data would sort of fit in well with this project.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I was just like simply curious. So yeah, totally understand that it had to be qualitative or like, yeah, for this particular question. But thanks for the answer.
Great, thank you everyone. We might move on to the next presenter. So now we have Mark Werner. So please start whenever you're ready.
Yeah, let me share my screen real quick. Great, can everyone see that? PowerPoint, okay, great. So my name is Mark Werner. I undertook my project with the help of the University of Texas at Austin Edward A. Clark Center for Australian and New Zealand Studies. My project looked at legislative success and the legislative agenda in the Australian Parliament, and in particular about the type and quantity of legislation that is passed in Australia. And so to begin, I guess the popular perception of the Parliament in Australia, based on what information I was able to find from news media sources and from academic research, through the early 2000s and on to today has generally characterized the Australian Parliament as quite ineffective, polarized, gridlocked, and as generally unable to accomplish much in the way of legislative goals. And this sort of context of the early 2000s gets us into a sort of broader discourse globally about political polarization on the increase internationally, on increasingly divided and gridlocked government across the globe, and on increasing polarization in general in Australia as well. And so my research project aimed to look in particular in this period of the early 2000s, from the years 2002 to 2009, at the legislative agenda to try to see if these sort of popular perceptions of Parliament were accurate or not. The reason I chose this particular period is because there was a mix of both divided and unified government during this period. By divided government, I mean a circumstance in which the Senate in Australia and the House are basically controlled by different parties, so that the party that has formed a government in the House doesn't also have a majority in the Senate. However, during this period in the early 2000s, there was also a brief period during the Howard government in which the coalition, the Liberal National Coalition, controlled both a majority of seats in the Senate and also a majority in the House, meaning that they had a unified government. And so the contrast between those two periods was something that I was interested in studying, and also the broader discourse of whether the trends in polarization have been in fact spilling over into affecting government's ability to pass legislation. And also there's some broader academic discourse that has been going on around this issue in Australia. In particular, there is increasing research that there is less bipartisan voting in the Australian Senate in particular, and that there has been a rise in new issues onto the political agenda and gaining traction in political discourse, particularly concerning the environment, climate change, immigration, civil rights, indigenous rights related issues that have increasingly cropped up on the agenda, really starting in the early 2000s. And so I wanted to sort of focus in on this particular period for that reason. And then, so the two sort of broad research questions I had were, has legislative output, the number of bills that end up getting passed by Parliament, declined over time? And secondly, has there been a qualitative change in the types of policy areas, the types of policy issues that have experienced the greatest rates of legislative success? So has there been a change in what sort of issues that governments have been focusing on? And then, so to try to answer these questions, I collected a data set of all bills that were introduced into the Australian Parliament between the years 2002 and 2009, which was a total of 1,739 bills in total. I gathered that data from the Australian Parliament website, aph.gov.au, and also from a second legal source called Ausley.com that has a lot of resources about laws that are passed in Australia. And in order to categorize bills by legislative success, I also found tracing those bills to see what percentage of bills over time tends to pass, which is the outcome variable for this project. So looking at when a bill is introduced, what is the likelihood that it goes on to pass, by seeing how many bills, according to each sort of policy area, end up becoming law. And then in order to look at what policy areas end up on the agenda overall, I coded each bill according to the policy area it deals with using the Australian Policy Agendas Project coding scheme, which has around 20 unique codes for different policy issues, ranging from environmental issues, immigration, macroeconomics, banking, labor issues, civil rights related issues, and a kind of broad spectrum of different policy areas that might appear on the agenda. And so in terms of results that I found from my project, in sort of getting at that first question about how successful governments have been in terms of passing their agenda, I found that over the period that I studied, that there was a general decline in the percentage of bills that passed. And so what this graph shows is basically the trend over time in the percentage of bills that are introduced that end up being passed into law. And as you can see, there was a decline, especially later on around 2009, compared to earlier in the data set in terms of bills that were passed. There was a brief spike between the years 2004 and 2005, which I believe coincided with the era in which the Howard government had a united government controlling both the Senate and the House, which suggests potentially that those conditions of unified government increased the amount of legislation that was able to be passed. But in general, there seems to be a downward trend over time in terms of legislative success, suggesting that there is an increased inability of legislation being successful in general. And then looking more closely at the trends in what policy areas get the most attention, can see in figure 1 that there tends to be a disproportionate focus in terms of bills that are introduced on issues of macroeconomics, healthcare policy, banking policy, and labor policy. In contrast, a lot of other issues concerning many important topics in civil rights, culture, community development, public land use, international relations, social welfare related issues, immigration have tended to receive a lot less attention. And there's a fairly substantial gap between, you can see the issues that receive a lot of attention like macroeconomics and virtually every other issue, which has tended to be neglected more by Australian government. And you can see in figure 2 that the figure 2 looks at the bill pass rate by broader issues. So breaking down each one of those issues, I sort of grouped them into one of 4 broad categories of either international policy issues, social issues, which includes things like health, education, social welfare, macroeconomic issues, and then post-material issues, which deals with some of these newer issues that have come onto the agenda, particularly concerning climate change, and immigration, migrant rights, and civil rights, especially for Indigenous people in Australia. And as you can see from the figure 2, that there has been substantially lower passage rate for bills concerning those post-material issues than virtually every other policy issue on the agenda. So not only are fewer bills being introduced in these neglected policy issues, but those that are being introduced are substantially less likely to be passed by the Parliament than those concerning international issues, social issues, and economic issues. And so in conclusion, you can see from the project that the sort of big takeaway is that there has been a substantial decline in terms of legislative success over time during the period studied. My hope is going forward with future research to expand the date range that I'm looking at to look at, expand the data set from the early 2000s all the way into today. And so rather than just looking at this narrow time frame, but in general, there appears to support, my project appears to support the popular perception that there has been a decline in the amount of legislative success that has been accomplished, and also that there has been a neglect of some particular issues on the Australian political discourse, particularly those concerning the environment, immigration, and civil rights that have received a lot less legislative attention and a lot less success in terms of passing legislation in those areas than other policy areas, which suggests that Australian democracy appears to be neglecting some of these very important issues that represent a lot of concerns that voters appear to be having. And I think that ends up being a quite pessimistic and negative thing for democracy in general, and in terms of the outlook going forward for Australian politics.
Great, thank you so much,
thank you.
Mark.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes again for questions. Judges, do you have anything you'd like to ask? Otherwise, happy to open up to other panelists as well.
Yes, I'd love to ask a question if I may.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, thank you for your presentation, by the way, Mark. I was wondering if you thought the dearth of macroeconomic policy demonstrated perhaps that the policy itself is the problem, not necessarily the polarization. Perhaps it's just not being effective and it's requiring constant revision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly one possibility. That could also explain that trend. I guess that getting at sort of questions of how effective particular policies are at achieving a result might be an interesting avenue for future research too.
Why did you think that that was one of the most highly prioritized areas for the Australian Parliament?
Well, I think if I go back quickly to look at the results, there was around like 196 bills that were introduced concerning macroeconomic policy issues, which is more than any other individual policy area. And the second place issue, of health policy was sort of substantially lower than macroeconomics. So that really sort of stands out as the issue where the most bills are being introduced into the Parliament, at least during the time frame that I looked at.
Thank you. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
We also have a question from the audience. So the question is, did you have any findings regarding the impact of the surging terrorism legislation during the Howard government?
In terms of sort of terrorism related legislation, it seems like the total number of bills was not necessarily that substantial compared to the overall legislative agenda. It seems like defense and military and anti-terrorism related legislation, that a much smaller number of bills were introduced compared to, say, macroeconomics. One of the reasons why I want to sort of broaden the time period for my research going forward is that to maybe compare the Howard government to both future and past governments, that perhaps there is a significant trend in terms of the Howard government focusing disproportionately on that compared to other governments. Maybe something going forward.
Great, thank you so much, Mark. We might move on. So our next presenter is Dylan James Woodhouse, so please start whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. I've also got a slideshow to show you, so hopefully that should keep you interested with some visual elements. Righty. So my research concerned a bit of a problem we're having in New Zealand, and that is growing gun crime rates. And despite this extensive policy reform, these suite of legislation we've had over the last few years following the Christchurch shooting, we're seeing ever and ever worse rates of gun crime. And I sought to provide perhaps a response as to why that might be, and to look at some possible alternative solutions. So broadly, I suggest that the increasingly complicated policy that is being produced is targeting the wrong areas. And that's the primary reason why we're seeing growing rates of gun crime, though it should be noted that that trend actually existed before the policy, and it was growing since 1997. So I know we're talking about an area that for our Australian viewers might be a bit unfamiliar, so I'm going to quickly run through sort of a whistle-stop tour of our firearms law history. But this is just to say that I wanted to start with the practical elements of the problem, and then progress on to perhaps what the policy might be doing wrong, so that therefore when we are talking about policy, we have more of an understanding of what it should be hoping to achieve. So briefly, I'll leave you to read that. What mainly preoccupied New Zealand legislators from the colonial era going forward has always been three main issues. Do we register firearms? Do we place more stock in licensing people and shy away from registration of the guns themselves? And also, how do we want to categorize various types of firearms, and do we place additional restrictions on certain varieties? So that's kind of the three main policy areas that have captivated legislation throughout our history. So in order to obtain a license prior to the Christchurch shootings and the reforms after it, there wasn't registration of most firearms. So the main means of ensuring public safety, there's always going to be a balance between personal freedom and property rights and public safety when it comes to an issue like firearms. We focused mainly on vetting the person. And for the law students here, the test for whether or not someone was fit to be a firearms owner has always been the fit and proper person test, which is actually the same as it is for lawyers over here in New Zealand, which is not to say that all lawyers are carrying guns. But just as a demonstration of what this complex category system looks like, here are some examples. And this is intentionally kind of overwhelming because policymakers, law enforcement have all had to navigate this web of different forms of classification and greater or lesser degrees of regulation. So some of these categories did have registration of firearms, whereas the majority didn't. However, following the Christchurch shootings and the 2020 reforms, we've seen a move towards registration of all firearms and a restriction of primarily self-loading rifles in ordinary license holders' hands. So that's the broad sweep of the reforms. But you'll notice that we can still obtain some of the more scary types of firearms, from machine guns and the like. We can still obtain those legally in New Zealand, but only on a collector's license or as part of commercial culling, which I believe is a similar situation in Australia. But there is an issue with resorting to this kind of category-based system. You create a system that is prone to absurdity sometimes. And an example of that is the only firearm out of these four that is patently illegal without any reasonable purpose for acquisition is actually the cowboy-looking gun in the bottom. One of those is actually a sort of an imitation rimfire, so a sporting rifle, and the other two could be obtained legally on a collector-grade license for part of a museum collection or a private collection. And just to really hammer home that point, this impressive collection of arms, all of these types can be legally owned in New Zealand for whatever reason. And you may have heard about our laws becoming incredibly strict and the like, and that sort of flies in the face of that perception. But of course, the importance has always been on the reason that you would wish to acquire such items. However, we do have a couple of types of gun that are completely illegal in New Zealand. For no reason whatsoever can you legally have these. And these are these types of sawed-off shotguns and firearms that are below the legal length requirements. And these are, in fact, the deadliest guns in New Zealand, not the machine guns or anything that's been recently prohibited. It's these types of firearms which criminals can obtain for between $50 and $150 on the black market, according to Greg Newbold's study. It's these types of firearms that are killing the most people in gang confrontations, in regular encounters with criminals, including aggravated robbery and murder. So it is not, in fact, the more impressive, terrifying looking firearms. It is these rather unassuming, disposable items which are the most dangerous. And that is because they are the most available. And the reason for that is, generally speaking, New Zealand's rather large and perhaps unmapped black market. And the concern in that is that it is coming from licensed firearms owners. And it's not necessarily by fault of their own, it's mainly through theft. Though there was a case of a man named Wade Innes who passed on $30,000 worth of firearms back when semi-automatics and the like could legally be acquired on regular licenses. And he passed all of those on to gangsters he associated with. So broadly, just to give you an idea of the extent of the illegal market, there were 1,068 firearms stolen between January of 2019 and July of 2020. And 884 of those came from license holders. And they were largely stolen from urban areas and in opportunistic thefts, according to research by Alpers and Walters. And the implications of that is, are we seeing deficient storage requirements for the firearms so that they are being stolen easily when someone breaks into a house, realizes that it's easier to carry away guns than a television? Perhaps they're just stumbling across them and they're not being locked away properly, or perhaps the police vetting is the issue of the vetting of the storage requirements. So that's something I'll address a bit more going forward. But in terms of the center of the issue, it is without a doubt gang members, which may be interesting because the reforms I've talked about before primarily affect the license holder as opposed to gangs and criminals, because it's difficult to create policy that directly targets criminals when they're already in violation of the law. So just a scary point there is 44% of patch gang members will commit firearms offenses at least once in their lifetime. So it's very much within that population that we are seeing the issue. So this is, as I've put there, it's intentional death by PowerPoint here. It's just a wall of text just to illustrate that only one of those would affect a problem population, that of mass killers. And that's a very dubious area to legislate for because it's difficult to predict the occurrence of mass shootings. So it's likewise difficult to legislate to prevent them. But all of the rest of them would not impede the effects of gangs, the efforts of gangs in society, except for this one, which is a recent requirement, which you might think would be somewhat common sense. But until this provision, it was actually possible, as Wade Innes demonstrates, to be a gang member and legally acquire firearms. However, there were provisions in police manuals to prevent this, but it didn't largely work. So we'll move on quickly just to say, essentially, despite all of that previous wall of text and many more reforms, we've even had some this year as well, we are no safer now than we were before the terrorist incident, which has given a lot of this legislation its steam. And this statistic here is really just to emphasize that despite the majority of legislation targeting firearms owners, legal owners, there's very little crime occurring within that population. So in terms of what policy responses we could offer, because I've sketched out the problem now, you can see what we could do about it. I've suggested raising the storage requirements because license holders' license durations are shorter now. We could quickly enforce that when they expire. And vetting is another key issue. I'll just pick up again one more time before I end. Again, responding to criminals with policy is difficult. We have seen more success in enforcement provisions such as Operation Torfero. In Australia, you might be familiar with firearms prohibition orders. We haven't implemented them yet. The government has said they are going to be doing it within the next couple of years, and they stepped over the opposition's attempt to create them. So we're not sure how that will work, but I'm positive that the searching without warrant of people we don't wish to have firearms will be a positive move in that arena. And finally, I'd just like to suggest that vetting is, in terms of the other problem area, which I haven't talked much about, which is the mass killer issue, which is a very rare occurrence in New Zealand. The best solution to that is in vetting. And I've controversially suggested that we remove the police from that role. And I hope one of you will ask me a question about that because I believe that's my time. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dylan. I will open it up now for Q&A. So if any of the judges like to go ahead.
I hope there was enough numbers in there for you, John.
Appreciate that.
If any of the other panelists have a question as well, please feel free to ask away.
Sure. I guess I'm wondering what are the differences between firearms laws in New Zealand compared to in Australia?
Well, they're becoming less and less different, to be honest. Prior to the shootings, we had a much more liberal regime than Australia has. I'm not particularly familiar with the Australian system, but I believe you do have registration, which is something we've moved towards. You do have firearms prohibition orders. It's a similar system to the UK, and it seems like a lot of Western democracies are moving towards more restrictive policies. Canada's doing similar things, and they seem to be having a bit more of a debate about it, but we're the fastest democracy in the West in New Zealand, which is not a title I think we should be proud of, and that means we have a lot of policy. I'm sure you'll be interested in this given your concern for legislative success. In New Zealand, we have a lot of legislative success in terms of passing laws, but I don't think we have very effective legislation made as a consequence. So in answer to your question, I don't really know the Australian system very much, but I think it's becoming more and more similar to what I know of it.
We do also have a question from the audience, Dylan, which was asking you to elaborate on what you said regarding the removal of the police.
I'm very pleased someone asked that. Yes, so I do have another slide on this, so I will show you that. The reason I am suggesting that we remove the police from this position is that the primary role of police has always been law enforcement, not policy making and not policy delivery. And they're very much better equipped to enforce policy. So the best example of this is transport. We don't have the police giving out road taxes and dealing with all of the registering of vehicles. It's simply too great an organizational task, but we do have them pull over people for speeding. And it should be that scenario happening in the world of firearms. And they were also responsible, unfortunately, for improperly vetting Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter, as the inquiry demonstrated. So I think it's time for an independent authority with a singular mandate, like our transport authority or something like that, to take over and to have a more specific emphasis on vetting, because that's very much an area that can be improved upon, as unfortunately the report of the Royal Commission demonstrates.
Great, thank you so much, Dylan. I think that brings us to the end of today's session. So a big thank you to our judges, Sally and John, and congratulations to the student presenters who did an amazing job. Your presentation was really, really interesting, definitely gave me a lot to think about. So this recording will be made available online following the conference, and we hope to see you in other conference sessions this week. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.